Okay, hi everyone. So welcome to my first attempt at a tutorial companion video to discuss the things that we went through in the tutorial this week. This is the second week of ENVR1190 in the 2024 winter semester. I'm going to go through this quickly and only cover some of the concepts, and you'll be encouraged to work on this on your own or use this video as kind of a side-by-side to help you complete assignment 1, which covers a lot of these same tasks that we're doing. So first example is example dataset 1. This is the same dataset that we used in lecture to discuss mean, median, and mode, and some of the other descriptive statistics for dispersion. And so this sheet has, in the first example, which is called sheet 1 in yours, has all of these different functions that we can use to calculate the statistics. What we talked about a lot was when you start writing your function, you can use the tab key to finish the function, and once you have it there, it starts to tell you what values each of the functions need. And that's going to be consistent across all of the different functions that Excel has. So if you wanted to start writing for standard deviation, which is this stdev.s, it will also give you what it needs, as the same for some of the functions we'll use later, which includes one like rand array or rand between, which tells you exactly what arguments it needs. And it separates the values within it by this comma, and the notation that's used within these is if the value is bolded and like this, then it needs to be included, whereas if the value is in these square brackets, it doesn't need to be included. And then these dot dot dots just mean that you can include any number of values after this first one. So I encourage you to go to example 2 and practice writing out all these same functions, so kind of referring back and forth. And then when you're ready, the easier way to do it is to grab this whole thing. And because each of these example sheets are set up in the exact same way, what you can do is simply copy and paste it into the same spot. So from here, we're copying from cell A20, and we're going to move it into cell A20. And when we do that, we're copying the Excel functions. And so B2 to B18 is the range that this function was citing in the other sheet. And when we move it into this sheet, it's still citing that same range. When we copy functions with the Control C and then the Control V key, it moves the range relative to where it is now. And so this one is now referencing that one. And if we grab this little green square in the corner, we can apply this function over other areas, and you'll see that it's always moving this range that it's citing depending on where it is. If we move this down, then now this range is 1 down. And so that's a really useful tool when you want to apply these kind of functions across multiple columns or across different data sets, or even just take the same functions to different areas. So that is the first part of the examples. The second part of the examples is pivot tables. And so while we can use functions to get a bunch of different descriptive statistics about this very simple data set that we have, we can also use a tool called pivot tables. And so all we have to do is go anywhere in this existing data set, and Excel will recognize that, oh, you probably mean this whole block of data. And we go up to Insert, and we go to Pivot Table. And when we hit Pivot Table, it says, okay, where's your data? And it shows us this flashing green block, and it's like, you want this data? So we say, yes, that's the data that we want, or we can change it by having that highlighted and clicking different areas. And you can just highlight this whole thing here. And it asks us, do you want it in a new worksheet, in which case it'll make a new one, or do you want it in an existing worksheet? And for this example, we're just going to put it right underneath of the existing pivot table that we have. So when we have a pivot table, this is the pivot table pane that pops up. And this allows us to take any of the columns that are in our data set and use them to group other things that are in our data set and then summarize using some different functions. And so for this very simple example, we only have one column, so we can't group things into columns or rows or apply filters. But what we can do is move this one into values. So I'm just grabbing it with the mouse and I move it down here. And you can see that it immediately defaults to using the sum function. And so it's telling us that the sum of all these values is 81. That's not very helpful for what we want. And so what we can do is we can click this little arrow on the side. And when we click this arrow, we can go to value field settings. And when we go to value field settings, we have all of these different options. These are limiting in pivot tables, so you do only have these options, but you do have some valuable options that are helpful for some easy summarizing. So for example, we can use the average function. You could also change the name of how it appears in the pivot table from here. And so we just want it to say average. So now we have the average. We can also add this data set into there multiple times, and we can change the function that we use. And we can use count, which is the one that we're using to get our sample size. And so you'll see that the count is 17, and that matches the sample size that we use from the count function. You can also see that our average matches the average that we calculated here. But you can see that there's a bit of a rounding difference. So one of the ways that you can get rid of all of these extra decimals when you have a value that pops out like this is in the Home tab, and you click these two buttons. So these ones increase decimals, so you can have all these different decimals for the values, or you can bring it all the way down to just one decimal, and you'll see that they're the same value. And that formatting is key for numbers, and you can apply it across whole groups of numbers. So I don't know if this will work because they're in separate pivot tables, but it should. Yeah. See, we can add decimals across all of these different numbers, and now they all have 2 decimal places. So the last thing that we want to cover when it comes to these data sets is how to produce some really simple figures. And so when you have anywhere on your data highlighted, again, Excel is going to recognize when you try to do something that it's all grouped together. So you can go to Insert, and you can look at any of these different types of graphs that we might have discussed in lecture. And so the first one that is already here is the box and whisker. And so we can make this box and whisker, and you can see that it's basically the same as the one that I have there, except we have some other options for changing some of the values that are there. So we have this little plus here that is allows us to add different chart elements. So if we want to add titles to the axes, or if we want to add the labels to our different elements of the data. And then once you have these elements added, you can click on them within the chart, and it highlights that element of it. And from that area, if you double click, it brings up the chart pane, and whichever element you have highlighted, you can edit all these different aspects of it. And so this is probably one of the key areas where you can change the maximum or the minimum of your axis to be whatever it is that you want it to be. I'm not sure why this one is popping up a little bit weird or different relative to this one right now. I'll have to look into that and get back to you on it. But right now, we're just looking at some very simple examples for these things, and you can play around with these, and you can go into the formats and the chart design to try and look at some different quick settings that you might have for any of these things. And you can kind of format them in different ways. And these are the types of figures that I'm going to want you to put into assignment 1 so that you can kind of practice with not just getting a figure, but also with writing the figure captions. So in addition to a box plot for this one, other appropriate charts that you might include would be a histogram. And in a histogram, you can change the width of the bins by highlighting the axis, clicking on this little axis options one in our figure pane, and going to the axis options. And you can tell it if you want it to be a specific width for the bins or if you want it to be a number of bins. And it might look nicer if we have, say, 5 bins for this one, or 4 bins. And we can get a look at how the distribution shape kind of shifts a little bit depending on how we're looking at these bins and grouping numbers within them. So that's the first part of the tools that we're using with the very simple examples. And now what we're going to do is, well, that was a way to just get rid of those pivot tables, is to delete all those columns. You highlight these and you just right click and press delete over all of the columns that the pivot table is in. But what we're going to do next is, this is just a way that you can examine some of the different standard deviations. And so this is a randomly generated data set where you can specify the standard deviation and the mean for these two groups and compare them on this graph. And so if I wanted this to be a standard deviation of 100 and the mean to be 500, you can change them there, and then these randomly generated data sets will pop up. And so what we're going to do for our first assignment is randomly generate a data set in the same way that our assignment 1 data are set up. And so there's two different ways that we can do this. The simplest one is with the rand array function. And so rand array is good because it allows you to specify rows, columns between different values and whether or not it's an integer or a decimal. But we had some issues in tutorial where some people didn't have that available. And so we ended up also using the rand between. But I'll show this what is known as an example. So you can specify that I want 20 rows, I want 10 columns, I want it to be between 0 and 10. And this tells you, this pop-up once you're in this argument, tells you that if you want it to be false or if you want it to be true. And if it's false, it's going to give you decimal values. And if it's true, it's only going to give you integer values. And I want it to just be integers because that's the type of data that we're mostly working with. Then I close the function with the circle bracket and I press enter. And boom, it gives me this whole thing. And you'll see that every time you press the F9 key or every time that you double click and then leave another cell, it's going to update these numbers to be random again. And we'll deal with that in a second. But we want to structure this data similarly to our other data that we're going to be working with for the assignment. And so we're going to add some column titles. And so we have QU1. And Excel is smart about 50% of the time. And so it recognizes that there's a number at the end of this character string of this text here. And so if we grab our little square at the bottom and we drag it across, you'll see that it recognizes that you want this to be part of a series. And so we can drag it all the way across and it should name all of our columns correctly. The only issue with this is if you use Q1, because if you use Q1, it thinks you're talking about quarters. And so it'll just do Q1 to 4, which is not what we want. So I didn't want to do that change. So what we can do is press Control Z and Control Z, and Control Z does the undo function. The other thing that we need as part of this data set is our ID column. And so this is our sampling unit, and it will be the ID of the person who did the survey itself. And so for our purposes, what we want is just a number of individuals all the way from 1 to 20. And so the easiest way to probably do this is just to write the number 1. And then in the cell below, you can write equals, and then you use the up key to say A2. And so now it's referencing the cell above it. And no matter where we move this function, it will always reference the cell above it. And so we say that we want this to equal the cell above us plus 1. And when we do that, we see that that one becomes 2. And then if we drag this function down, you'll see that each one of these is referencing the cell above it and is saying, let's do that plus 1. And that's an easy way that we can get some series of numbers. And there's lots of ways that you can do that. And you can spend probably a weird amount of time on a rabbit hole about how to just calculate sequences of numbers in Excel. But this is one easy way to do it. So now what we want to do is we want this to stop randomly generating. So what we're going to do is we're going to press Control A. And Control A is Control All, basically, and it highlights all of the data. So from Control All, we can press Control C, and that's going to copy it. And we're going to move it to a new sheet, and we're going to right-click on the first one and say paste the values. If we paste just the regular paste, it's going to paste the functions by default, and then it will keep randomly generating. But if we hit this paste values 1, 2, 3, what happened there? Paste values 1, 2, 3, then you'll see that these are no longer functions. These ones are the functions, and they'll keep randomly updating, and these ones are just the values. So what I want you to do for the assignment is to basically do the same thing that we had done in the example and calculate some of these summary statistics. And so there's a couple ways that you could do it. You could copy and paste some of these functions. And so we could copy and paste that there. And you'll see that this error comes up where it says this formula refers to a range that has additional numbers adjacent to it. And what that means is that we're only citing from B4 to B20, so it's missing these other two numbers. And there's a couple of ways that you can fix this. So you can use these little corners to pull the data to the area that you want it. Or you can use this one, which is update formula to include cells. And so now you'll see that by clicking that little triangle in the corner and then clicking that update formula to include cells, it has this whole thing. Or you can just go right into the function itself and you can say, okay, well, I want it to be from B2 to B21 to cover this one. You could also just highlight all this and highlight the area that you want. So that's a couple of different ways that you can take that function and adjust it. You can also just write out the function and boom, you'll get the same thing. Once we have, so I want you to write sample size, mean, standard deviation, median, first quartile, that 25th percentile, the third quartile, that 75th percentile, and that's pretty much all I need you to do for this assignment. It says in the instructions to include the interquartile range and the whisker lengths, but I won't be requiring those as much. This is all just practice right now. So once we have those, we can start to write out our functions. So we say average of this group again, and we do that, equals standard dev dot P is for the population, S is for the sample, and we're working with samples, so we do that one. And then we do median, which is this one. We can do quartile, and for quartile, there's two options. There's exclusive, which means that it will be exclusive of the values that are in the data set, and so you could get a quartile of like 1.5 or 1.36 or something like that. But the inclusive one returns one of the values that's actually in the data set. And so we're going to use that one. And what this function wants is the array. And so we say, okay, this is the range of values that we want to use. And then we also need to specify quartile. So we do a comma, and then it pops up with which one of these do you want? And right now we want the first quartile. So we can double click here, we can press tab, or we can just write the number 1 in there. We close our function, good to go. And then we do the same thing, equals quartile, inclusive, tab, the array from B2 to B21, and then we do the quartile, which is the third quartile. Now, since we have these all calculated across, we can highlight them, and we can grab our little square and just apply it across all of them. And you'll see that these values are different and that they are calculating the various summary statistics, descriptive statistics for each one of these columns independently. Boom, real easy. So I'm going to call this tab survey data. Naming your tabs is an effective way to keep track of things so that you can help get through it later. You can also open the navigate pane. Usually you can. Sometimes it decides to be a little bit difficult. Well, yeah, we'll skip that for now. So now that we have this, this is one of the things that you're going to have to present to me. And so what we're going to do is also transform this into, so first of all, there's a couple of different ways, but we're going to want these with it, these question numbers. But for the sake of this time right now, let's just do this. So we can copy all of our summary statistics. We go to a new tab and we can paste these as values. If you paste them regularly, you're going to get references because it thinks you're trying to calculate stuff based on the columns above. But you can click this little control and you can say, actually, I want the values instead. And now we just have our values. And what we're going to do is copy this again, and then we can just paste it to another area where we transpose it. And so now we have it flipped on its head so that we have all these different values in a table like this. Then what we're going to do is go back to our survey data, and we want the question numbers. So we're going to copy and paste all these question numbers, which are in the same order, and we're going to put them over here right beside it, and we're going to paste those. Oops, we don't want it like that, right? So what we're going to do is transpose them. And so now we have our question, sample size, mean, standard deviation, median, quartile 1 and quartile 3 for these. And this is the table that you'll put into your final report. You'll format it to make it look nice, change maybe some of these decimals, and then you'll put it into you'll make sure that there's a caption for it as well. Easy enough, right? So this is our first method of doing our summary table, but I'm also going to show you some of the cooler methods of doing our summary table. And so this is what's called a wide data format. And so we have a single variable, or a single sampling unit has a single row. Each one of the variables that we're calculating for it has a single column. But in order to use some of the other tools that Excel has, we need to transform this from being in this wide data format to what's called a long data format. And the way that we do that is actually quite simple. And so what we do is we press the Alt-D. And so when you press Alt-D, you can take your hands off, and you can see that this Office key access comes up. And then what you can do is press P. And what that does is it brings up the pivot chart and pivot table wizard. And right now, I'm not sure why it's not showing. I think it's something to do with the screen share. Alt-D, P. There it is. Weird. And so when this pivot table wizard is up, what we're going to do is press multiple consolidation ranges. Go to next. Create a single page field for me. And then it tells us, oh, which data do you want? And so we go to our data set, we press Control All, or we just highlight the whole data set, and then we press Add. Then we go to Finish. Now you can see that we have, we're going to move this sheet all the way to the end, and so pivot survey data. And now we have all this data in a pivot table. And what's cool about pivot tables is that you can click anywhere on the pivot table, and if you double click it, it's going to pop up all of the values for it. And so if we go down to here, we double click that one, and all of a sudden you can see that we have our long form survey data. And so what this is actually showing us is that the row is the ID, the column is the question, and then we have our value. We don't need this page 1, so we can highlight that whole column and we can delete it. Now what we can do is we can make another pivot table based on this table. And when we do that, it says, oh, you want this table? And we say, yes, let's put it into a new worksheet. So this will be our second summary sheet. And so what we do is we say, well, we want the questions to be our rows. So we drag that down to there. And then we want to calculate values based on the values. And so again, Excel says, oh, it's a bunch of numbers. You probably want the sum. So we go into the value field settings and we say, hey, actually, we don't want sum. We want the average. And we just want to call it mean. And so you see that you can start to get different information for these ones, and you can use these limited functions that are available in order to summarize your data similarly to how we were before. You can use the formatting to change the number of decibels that are shown, and you can use it to get a couple of different summary statistics. Easy going. So that's part of the bonus work. So you don't need to do that in order to get full marks, but it might be helpful to know how to do this as a method in the future. Another way that you can go back to our raw survey data here, which is this table, and you can use Power Query to do all of these things at once. And this is a new method to me, and I think it's definitely one of the most interesting ones. And so what Power Query does is it allows you to do a whole bunch of different transformations and keep track of what you're doing. So if you right click anywhere in this table, you can say get data from table range. And what it's going to do is it says, okay, you want to make a table. My table has headers because it has this first column, that's the name of the column, or this first row, that's the name of the columns. We click OK. And what it does is it's going to open up the Power Query. Any minute now. My computer deciding to take a little bit of time, even though we're taking a video here, but it should be a pretty quick process to get into this. So now you can see that we have our table pulled into Power Query. At the top here, it has the code that it's using to figure out what it's doing with each of the different things. And in the side here, it tells us what steps it's done. And so it goes from the source, and then it immediately says, these are probably numbers, and so we're going to change the type to being numbers. Now what we can do is we can get into long form really easily using Power Query. And so we highlight this column by clicking the top. Then we use the shift, we hold down shift, and we press the right arrow key. And that allows us to highlight multiple columns. And so we'll highlight all of these columns. And then what we're going to do is go to the Transform tab, and we go to Unpivot. And now you can see that we have this exact same long form data setup that we had before. And so we have ID, and we have attribute, but it's not attribute really, it's question, right? And then we have value. So what we're going to do is use Power Query to do what we did with the pivot table, except in another way. And so what we can do is we can tell it that we want to group by, because we want to summarize by our question number. And so we click Group By. And it brings up this thing. And if it's basic, it assumes that you only want to do one, but if you one summary column. But if you go to advanced, it allows you to create multiple summary columns. And so at the top here, it's saying which columns do you want to group by? And right now we want to group by question, right? If you have other ones in here, you can click these little 3 dots to delete them. So we want to summarize by question, and we want one column that is the mean. And the operation that we want to do is the average, and we want to do it for the value column because we want to take the average of the values. We can also do count, and so this will be our sample size. And let's actually put that one first so we can move that one up. So sample size, and it doesn't need a column because it's just counting the number of rows. Then we can do some other ones. So what else do we have here? We have some limited options, but you can actually go in and into the code that's up at the top and change them that way. So we'll do that in 1 second. So right now I will just add a column that says standard deviation, and we'll just leave it as count rows. So now you can see that we have our wonderful summary table. That's the same structure as what we were at before. And so the last thing that we're going to want to do is go into this code, and we can see that we have our code here for what stdev, this column, is actually doing when we're grouping the rows. And so you see that it's using this function, which is called table count row, and that's not what we want. And so what we're going to do is take the same information that we have over here, which is this whole block that's within these kind of round brackets, and we're going to copy that. And then we're going to paste it over here, over the function that it has there. And so now it's saying it's going to list the median, but we don't want the median, do we? Right? So we want to delete median, and we want to say list dot standard deviation. And when you start typing, it's going to pop up with a whole bunch of stuff, and it's going to do that. Then what we can do is press enter, and now we have our standard deviation. So to get out of here, what we do is we go back to the Home tab, we click Close and Load, and what that's going to do is it's going to pop up another sheet, and it's going to populate this query. You'll see that this is from me running through this example with each of the tutorials, and now we have our summary table. And it has all this stuff. You can edit it and do all that things. And what's cool is that this is actually really, this is related to the survey data table. And so if I were to change this value to be 50, for example, in our table, you can see that it drastically shifts for question 5, it changes the standard deviation, and it changes the mean. So now what we can do is we can go back to this table, and because it's querying using Power Query our table data, what we can do is right click and go to refresh, and it updates those values. And so this is a much more reproducible way to get some of these summary statistics. So that about does it for tutorial 1. I hope that this companion video, which took me 1/2 hour to create, helps you to get through assignment 1.